Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm Ryan Davis. I'm the Executive Director of KQED Live, and I am delighted to welcome you to KQED Live from the Commons here in our newly renovated headquarters in San Francisco's Mission neighborhood. KQED Live is a new live events series, multi-platform, here in person and streaming on live, dedicated to bringing journalism to life on stage, amplifying local culture, and building community. We are thrilled to be presenting this special onstage conversation between Bay Area literary icon Amy Tan and her longtime friend, KQED's veteran interviewer and host emeritus of Forum, Michael Krasny. And it's on nights like tonight that we make KQED's mission to inform, inspire, and involve tangible. We do this through vivid conversations, screenings, performances, live storytelling, and much more. And you can learn more about our events and get tickets like this at kqed.org/live. We also want to thank the season sponsors that make KQED Live possible. They are Asian Art Museum, Berkeley Rep, Comcast Business, and Oakland International Airport. We're so grateful for their commitment to supporting our mission of civic and cultural engagement in the Bay Area. And as a special treat tonight, our sponsors at the Asian Art Museum have donated 3 pairs of tickets for randomly selected audience members to attend the new exhibition, Team Lab Continuity. It features lush imagery drawn from nature and East Asian art that dynamically evolves around you as you move. Their last batch of tickets go on sale next week, but 3 lucky winners of that giveaway tonight are Mary Singer, Sarah Fan, and Elvis Merks. If you can raise your hands, we've got tickets right here for you. Oh my gosh, and you're all on the aisle somehow. That's amazing and convenient. Well, thank you. I want to thank all of you for being among the first members of our public to bring this space to life and for staying committed to the value of gathering. Let's take care of each other tonight. I know that policy in San Francisco has adjusted slightly, but still at spaces like this, please keep your mask on throughout the program. And I also want to remind you that we want to hear your questions. So you might have received question cards and golf pencils or pens on your way in. If you have one and you want to share a question now, ushers will come by and collect them. Just pass them to the ends of the aisle. And be sure to write succinctly and legibly, and we'll work as many of those into the conversation as possible. Okay, now, it's my great pleasure to give the stage to our host this evening. Not only is he an illustrious broadcaster, having been at KQED's flagship public affairs and culture radio program Forum for nearly 3 decades, he's also an esteemed academic and critic. He's a professor of English at San Francisco State, and himself is the author of numerous books on literature and memoir. Please join me in welcoming Michael Krasny.
Welcome and good evening, and I must say it's a pleasure to be back in this building. This is a very different building than the one that I left actually just a couple of years ago when we were on Beale Street and we were there through the pandemic. But I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be with Amy Tan in conversation. I hope that some of you will be not only willing but able and uninhibited with asking questions, whatever's on your mind. We're going to have what I hope will be a fluent and in-depth conversation. There's much that I'd like to talk with her about, and we've had the distinct pleasure, I've had the privilege of interviewing her a number of times through the years. We've become friends. And I should say that she has become really one of our premier recognized novelists, and it all started out with the Joy Luck Club, but there have been many books since then. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss any. The Kitchen God's Wife, The 100 Secret Senses, The Bonesetter's Daughter, Saving Fish from Drowning, The Valley of Amazement. and she's been translated into 35 languages and has had a number of bestsellers. She's also someone who takes writing very seriously, and for those of you who are serious readers or aspiring or serious writers, there's much to learn from Amy. She now, in fact, is one of those masterclass masters, and we're going to see a cut from that in the course of the evening. Just out of curiosity, how many of you had an opportunity to see the production that was recently on PBS and Netflix about Amy that was done? A number of you here? I was just curious. Well, let me not tarry at all, and let me simply ask you to give a warm San Francisco KQED welcome to Amy Tan. Well, like I said, lots for us to talk about and lots for us to explore. I thought we'd begin, though, by asking you about the documentary you did with Jamie Redford, who sadly and most tragically passed away. This is Robert Redford's son, of course, and a really fine documentary filmmaker who lived here in the Bay Area. I think that you become sort of a rock star, superstar. That, however, puts you in a whole different category of American masters and all of that. And it was shown, as I said, not only on PBS, but also on Netflix. Did you feel the impact of that in any specific way you care to talk about?
Well, first, when Jamie approached me with this, I told him, I said, I'm not that famous. And he wanted to do this for other reasons having to do with trauma and survival. But after it was done, I kind of felt like everybody knew my personal life, and I didn't know them. Wherever I went to party, oh, I saw that, I never knew. And I didn't know if their perception of me had changed. So I felt a little awkward.
Yeah, I know you felt that way writing your memoir, too, which we can talk about. In fact, I'd like everybody to see a clip from the movie, and we can use this as a kind of catalyst for some conversation here. This is from the documentary of Jamie Redford's on Amy Tan.
Where is her photos? What did I do with it? I used to have this all organized. And now, okay, let me see. This is my mother as a young woman with her friends. This is the back of the mansion where she lived, just out of Shanghai. Okay, so. In my office is a time capsule. 7 large, clear plastic bins safeguarding frozen moments in time. A past that began before my birth. During the writing of this book, I delved into the contents, memorabilia, letters, photos, and the like. And what I found had the force of glaciers calving. I am not the subject matter of mothers and daughters or Chinese culture or immigrant experience that most people cite as my domain. I am a writer compelled by a subconscious neediness to know, which is different from a need to know. The latter can be satisfied with information. The former is a perpetual state of uncertainty and a tether to the past.
I find that poignant, the neediness to know versus the need to know. Maybe we could start out talking about that. But were you satisfied for the most part with the film and happy about it?
I was surprised by the film, how tenderly he had done that, how sensitively. And there were parts I was surprised at because I didn't know he was going to film and put that in there. So the very beginning of me sorting through those photos, I thought was just my trying to find photos for him. And the entire time they were filming. And they did tell me it was just, no, we're just doing that to get a sense of the photos you have. So you have to be careful with people who do that. But he was always asking me, do you approve? If you don't, at the end, you can always say, no, forget it, or anything I didn't like, I could change. And I really appreciated, his sensitivity to my life.
In that same spirit, you can tell me if you don't like any of my questions this evening. I'll withdraw them.
We've been doing this for 30 years, Michael, and I think I'm used to taking any of your questions.
And I can say...
Except for the National Reserve. I don't want to talk about that.
No, we won't. But let's talk about what you were bringing up there, which is the need to write and the sense of exploring the uncertainty. And you also have talked a lot about writing and the great satisfaction it gives you. You've said, I think, and it sounds superlative, but I think it's consonant with your feelings and your sensibility, that it gives you more meaning than anything. Now, I mean, we have to put Lou against that, or family and so forth. But the reality is, you have so many other interests, and by seeing that film, people learn about your work with photography, your work with birds. You rock bottom reminders as a dominatrix. So many almost avatars that you've had, and yet writing stands out and continues to drive you. And what always fascinates me is, where does that narrative drive come from? What compels it? You talk about your unconscious, and you talk about neediness. So spell that out if you can.
First of all, I think that all those things that you just mentioned feed into this neediness to know. But I also believe that part of it started because my father was a minister, and so he was also, in a way, questioning morality and God and his sense of devotion. And even though I'm not religious the way he was, it led me to think this is what you need to do with your life. Constantly put yourself in jeopardy of not knowing the right thing and doing the wrong thing. I think for many writers, the story that you read is not simply about the narrative, the storyline, or even, the characters. They are part of an examination of morality. I was just listening to Jonathan Franzen talk about this, that we're looking at moral questions that we have no answers to. And by delving into a whole story where we don't exactly know the outcomes, we are flaying ourselves. We are out there exposing ourselves and all the contradictions we have. With that comes the past, my experiences growing up, which includes a lot of trauma. And that gets funneled in there. What do I know about that? What do I know about humanity? What do I know about myself? And what's important? We're all searching for meaning, I think.
So you're looking for truth. You're looking for emotional truth and truth about humanity. But you mentioned morality, and I wonder, where does that come in? Because stories are often told in ways that some people think that stories are told best when they leave out the answers, when they just leave us with the questions. Where do you stand there, or do you stand there?
I think that there's no one absolute truth. So definitely I feel I would never have an ending that says love is forever or whatever the pat phrases are. I think what a writer can do is bring out not just the questions, but the nuances that make that very difficult to come up with an answer. So for example, you have circumstances, a very large one, a mother killing somebody to protect her child. There are circumstances involved, and morally it's wrong to kill somebody. You throw in those things, and you have to, sort through a lot more about what you mean by motherhood, about protection, about violence and revenge or all those things. How do we deal with that? And a story can, through imagination, place us in that situation so that we are asking those same questions.
Well, you've written a lot of stories, but you also wrote a memoir more recently. And I was thinking about, looking through those pictures, something Paul Auster once said to me, the rather well-known novelist, that the difference between a memoir and a fictional story or a novel is with a memoir, it's like looking through a cabinet and remembering where things that were in there in different drawers, whereas when you write a novel, you're in an altered state. Does that resonate with you, that kind of dichotomy?
I think when you're writing a memoir, you're also in an altered state. For me, at least, I was carried back to moments that are highly emotional, and to get back into those and remember that with some degree of exactitude was simply to capture the emotion of the time. I may not remember exactly what dress color my mother was wearing, but I will remember the emotions. And to me, it becomes a suspended state where you're away from the present and you're there. So like fiction, it has a different consciousness. Not necessarily the same, because in fiction you're also working on the craft of it and trying to drive the story forward, or create the complexities and keep it consistent. So the craft is much more involved. But with a memoir, there is this very deep question of what's the truth in your life. So I had a traumatic experience writing that book. Where the past begins. I didn't know that I would get into these areas. They surprised me. It was, the cabinet of curiosities and nightmares. By the way, I figure in one of Paul Auster's memoirs.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. He actually got it a little wrong. But he asked, I read it, and he was right there. Did I get it right? And I said, yeah. Kind of.
Well, your memoir had a lot to do with your editor, Daniel Halpern, and I wanted to ask you maybe to talk a bit about how editors play a role in terms of the final product of the novel before it comes to fruition, because or the memoir for that matter, just the role of editors, and it might even address the role of our mutual friend and someone who had a lot to do with the Joy Luck Club and other writing, Molly Giles, who was also sort of part of your team. A lot of people think, Amy Tan sits down and, she polishes things off and then the thing is out there and so forth. But most books, great books particularly, have a lot of, they're not like movies, which are, huge teams, but they have editors and they have people who are involved. Central in many ways to your work, aren't they?
I think that the editors work differently. I mean, there's some basic things. They acquire your book if they're in a publishing house, and they shepherd things through. But not every single editor in a publishing house will give you the attention you need to improve your craft, or to look at the story and say, I think you can leave off this character. I was really lucky to have that in Dan. I mean, Dan would write pages and pages and pages about my book. He loved it. He says, he would write about what he thought the characters were addressing. Molly Giles was my first teacher, editor, mentor, and she was brutal in a good way. She would say things that most people wouldn't like. This is boring, I'd cut. And she was right. I would say 95% of the time she was right. There were times when I just realized I wasn't clear enough, or I could make it interesting. I hadn't tied it to the story sufficiently. So those kind of remarks, when somebody really intuits what you're trying to do, is a gift to a writer. I don't do that so much in the beginning of my writing these days, but I definitely want somebody there. I never feel like I'm the expert simply because I got published. And I think a lot of writers feel that way, this terror that you've lost it somehow, and you need somebody to say, no, you have found the way. And maybe if you polish it up here or there, looking for deeper questions to ask, for example.
You've also said, I think on a couple of occasions, that writing fiction makes you feel safe. Why is that?
It's a subterfuge. I can hide behind it in a way. So I could write the same thing that I wrote about in a memoir, about a trauma, about a mother who's suicidal and watching her nearly kill herself. And it's very different when I treat it as my life, and it's my mother and it's me in the car watching her try to jump out of the car on the freeway. And if I take that same emotion and feeling and put it in a fictional character, and it may be in a different time period, I have a little safety there, and then I can change things if I want. I can have different interventions happening in the plot. And I still want to make it as deep as the experience, that the emotional core of it is still there, but I'm hiding in a way through fictional characters.
Yeah, I think you once said about your mother, she wasn't a tiger mom, she was a suicidal mom.
Yeah.
And so much influence psychologically in terms of your craft and what spurs you on as a writer goes back to Daisy, your mother. But you mentioned your father, and I was struck by that because a lot of people associate you because so much of Joy Luck Club and other work has to do with mothers and daughters. But your father, not only a Baptist minister, but someone who you said really invaded you with the idea of morality. And so how does morality figure in your work as a fiction writer?
Well, one of the important tenets that I have about morality is that we need to find the truth. There is no truth. You need to go looking at it. And the truth is found in 5-10 billion stories. You know, we each have our truth and how that came to be through our situation, our circumstances, the interactions we've had. My father, on the other hand, believed in absolute truth, in absolute morality, in God's word, and that there was a book that told you what was right and wrong. And I think that it was the year that my brother and my father got sick that really put that to the test. My belief in a system that dictated what truth was, what morality was. I believed that if I was a good girl and I followed the Bible, I would be part of the reason they would be saved. And instead, my brother died first after 6 months of a brain tumor, and 6 months later, my father died of a brain tumor as well. And as a child, you begin thinking, wait, this is not how the world works. Now, it's not the reason why I would have lost faith. It was the reason why I realized it was such a shock that I had to look for what was true by asking the questions and finding it. And some of the things I found do line up with certain religions. You know, I'm not against many of the religions, except, those that are very exclusive of a lot of humanity. But it propelled me to ask those questions. And how do I figure into it, this morality? Do we make any difference individually or collectively?
We've alluded to the fact that we've done a number of interviews through the years, both on stage and on the radio, and as I said, I've developed this friendship that, not only Amy and I have, this is sort of full disclosure, my wife and I have with Amy and Lou, her husband. I thought maybe we'd hear a clip from one of the interviews we did, but before we do, I went back and listened to an interview that involved Amy and someone she was shepherding through San Francisco by the name of Pascal Toussaint, who was a cabaret singer in Paris, whom she discovered with a mutual friend of ours who we both love dearly, Kathy Goldmark, who actually kind of founded the Rock Bottom Reminders or set them in motion. And what was so astounding about him was his voice on the one hand, but on the other hand, he came and Kathy saw to it that he performed at Yoshi's, and it's quite a sensation. He's still there performing in Paris. And I wanted people to just to know about that role that you have as, he called you his China mother and his San Francisco mother. So she's kind of a stage mother too. She's helped a number of careers on their way of writers as well as even singers and so forth. But let's hear something from an interview I did with Amy. Our guest is Amy Tan. Her new book is Where the Past Begins, a writer's memoir. Alicia writes, you think that you were able to see things more clearly about the past at midlife and again after 50?
Every person is going to change their view of their life, I think, as the decades go on. I certainly did. By the way, I forgot to mention that I did have a miscarriage. I did not have an abortion, so the question was taken care of by this misfortune. But I do feel that I could never write the same book. For example, Joy Luck Club. If I were to write it today, it would be a completely different book, because as you're writing, there are different perspectives and things that are important. So the same with Memoir, because I draw from experiences, emotional experiences, as I am writing fiction. The question of how I would look at my mother and the suicidal attempts that she made. And
She actually just jumped out of a car, right?
she tried to jump out of the car. She tried to run into the street on Van Ness Avenue with a lot of traffic. And these things were very sudden. But combining that with finding letters and knowing more about her life and where this originated, I didn't know many years ago all the details I know now about my grandmother and how that might have affected my mother as a child. And so the information you discover, as well as information about yourself, adds to how you remember events. You get to see how much of yourself has been influenced, has taken on some aspects of a parent's character.
Yeah, what fascinates me about that excerpt is the notion of how emotions are accommodating memory, or memory accommodates emotions. And let's start off with, what would the Joy Luck Club be today? I know you don't necessarily feel a thrill when you go back and look at the Joy Luck Club, because it's been many years and it's way behind you and you're moving forward. But what you found out about your mother with facts, but also with the emotional memories.
You mean, how would I change that book if I were writing it today?
Would it be a different novel? What would it be?
I think it would be a much darker book. Joy Luck Club, as written, is probably Daisy Tan light. There would certainly be different issues that would come up having to do with, who we are today as a country and what is going on in China. So, everything feeds into fiction as well as memoir. It's a channel of many different things coming in to the writing, to the thought process. When I talked about how our perspectives change over time, I think you can look at it as different lenses. At the ophthalmologist's office or optometrist, they're always saying, you're looking through this testing, and they're flipping the lenses. Is it one or is two better? And you keep doing that. Well, I think that it's similar as we encounter different experiences through the lens of tragedy, through the lens of grief, through the lens of misfortune. We're going to look at something differently. And so with Joy Luck Club, I didn't have as many lenses then. And some of it was due to lack of awareness, or that these emotions or memories where the questions had not surfaced. And so now, as a writer, has more to do not with my skill as a writer as much as my experiences. In, 4 months, I'm going to turn 70. I cannot believe that. But in those 70 years, I have had so many rich experiences, not all good. But those are all necessary. They're all what made me who I am.
Well, speaking of that, you've had struggles, as many know, with Lyme disease and some certainly terrible challenges as a result of being afflicted with it. How much do those shape your imagination? You also have had trauma. I mean, and trauma, some writers say, can actually be a catalyst and be a force in creation. I'm just wondering how these things, in other words, if there's anything general that can be said about them.
One is that I have a great deal more compassion for people who've gone through mental illness or chronic disease. You know, having Lyme disease is a combination of a mental illness and a serious disability for many who are overcome with the symptoms. You're constantly anxious. And with the trauma, it's the same thing. People who suffer from PTSD, I know what that is. I have a great deal of compassion for people like that. So with these experiences, I take them, and hopefully, without my attempting to use them in a self-improvement course, that I take them naturally, and I'm opening myself to those emotions as directed to others.
Is there something frightening sometimes about opening yourself that way? There's a vulnerability implicit in it, isn't there?
You know, I operate out of sort of naivete, which is what was a characteristic of my mother. She would, as in the film, she would talk about things that many people would never mention in front of anybody, even their kids, like her sex life from her first marriage, you know. She used to say these things. I would say, no, I don't want to hear this anymore. When I was writing and I needed it for my stories, it's like, tell me more. But she was a loose cannon at times. She was uncensored, self-censored. She would tell people, walk up to friends at a party and say, oh, you got fat, I like you the other way, you know, or did you do that to your hair? I mean, you know, she was a very kind and compassionate person, but she was also a little too truthful.
She was sort of under an influence of an inner truth serum.
Yeah, well, I don't know what the reason was that she would just pour things out, her feelings. One of them was she never could feel deeply enough, and she was always trying to get me to feel as deeply as she did, and I don't think she knew where that bottom was. And so there was a great deal of dissatisfaction in my inability to completely empathize with her. I do feel that I got a little bit of that where I start talking about my life, and I don't have a self-consciousness that says, you know, don't talk about that. People are going to know a little too much about who you are. And maybe that's a quality of a writer, or maybe it's the influence of a mother who was unbuffered.
Well, I'm interested in pursuing this in maybe another direction for a moment, because you've been talking about empathy and identifying with characters and identifying with emotions that can be projected into characters you create who cast real shadows and become multidimensional, round characters, as E.M. Forster said, as opposed to flat characters and all of that. But it's always struck me that when you're projecting so much of your own emotional material into characters and into stories and storytelling, there's always that sense that, well, let me cut to the chase here. Henry Louis Gates just gave a speech for American Pen. And Amy and I did an event a year ago for the Berkeley Humane Society, because we're both animal lovers. And I did the same event a few nights ago with Jennifer Egan, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of many novels, including A Visit from the Zagoon Squad. But we were talking about the Gates lecture, because Gates said, we're in too many silos now. I'm kind of paraphrasing, you know. He said, since when does somebody of a certain color have to be writing about people of that particular color? I mean, you're an Oakland writer, you're a Chinese writer, you're an Asian American writer, you're a woman writer. And I think what he was saying was, what about racial and gender lines? If you have the imagination that can empathize and cross over that line, you know, Flaubert said, Madame Bovary, c'est moi, I am Madame Bovary, or Tolstoy, Anna Karenina. Have the lines become too distinct and too sharp, do you think, and maybe too strong?
I deliberately try to remove those lines if I'm thinking about it, because in fiction, if I go into these different segments of who I am or who society is, I am not going to be able to create natural characters. I'm always going to be thinking about characteristics in that way. So it's difficult at times. On the other hand, I'm also writing about the kind of characters or situations that appeal to me. And it's much in the same way that you choose friends or who you want to have a conversation with. Not that they're always going to be people like you, for example, with the conversations at the dinner table. But there are many ways that they're going to be interesting as people, no matter, what their circumstances. And, so that's what I try to do, not looking at these silos, as you mentioned, but the whole of these people. And yes, those parts sometimes come in. And what I like to do then is to find the perfect sentence, the perfect image that captures a huge facet of a very complex character.
But can you get out of, for example, with empathy or with imagination, your own sense as your own heritage, your own being a Chinese woman? Can you create a Caucasian man or a black man and get inside his head?
I have to ask myself, why would I want to do that? And it's not a matter of can I do that, and will that improve me as a writer or as a human being? I don't think that's the case. We have many different avenues for discovering who we are in relationship with people, and class and color and those issues, young, old. I believe that it is important to have, a range of experiences and people that we've met to understand those. But I don't have to write about all of it. I don't have to be a man to prove that I understand humans. And that's what I ultimately want to get to. What I'm writing about is human nature. And human nature includes gender. It includes many of those things.
Human nature is something universal. I mean, people praise your work as they say, you write about Chinese characters, but you write about universal truths, which is the highest praise I think an author can get. And does that necessarily limit the author? I mean, I remember Toni Morrison saying to Bill Moyers at one point, you have to come to us. He was essentially suggesting maybe she had to write for a greater audience and write about white people or something along those lines. I'm not sure where he was going at the time, but she certainly corrected him and said, the universal can come through the particular.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're saying.
I, by accident, discovered that in the first book. I just realized, as I was writing it, I thought, no one's going to read this. It's about weird Chinese characters, and people don't read books like this. And when it was actually bought by my editor at the time in this publishing house, I thought, well, it'll disappear off the shelves in a few weeks, and that'll be it. Not knowing that people would have this reaction that you're talking about, that they felt it was a story about themselves, even though they didn't have a similarity with the culture or the mother. It was about emotions. And the way that I can capture that the best is to not be self-conscious, not to be conscious of the audience, the readers, and my saying, oh, gee, if I write about this, that man in Texas is not going to understand this, and they will misinterpret. And I have been banned in Texas and other places, people who did not understand what I was trying to write. They, if you write about yoga, they think you're promoting Buddhism or something. I don't know. So they find a way to misinterpret. But I can't think about that. I would be thinking about everybody who would misinterpret or what they would get out of it. So it's a difficult task as a writer for me to get into a story, to
So do you have a reader in mind at all when you write?
No, I can't have a reader. It's certainly not not a reader I know, except for my mother and my grandmother, who I never knew. They are, in some ways, the people I believe would know me intimately and know what I'm capable of, and also know when I'm hiding behind just a pat phrase or some sort of cliche. They would understand that, and they would push me. My mother, with her desire to go deeper and deeper, to find the deepest meaning, the deepest emotion she could, to feel deeply. And that's what I got from her, the need to feel deeply.
So there's a little woo-woo maybe sometimes, your spirit of hers operating with you when you're writing?
Is Lou, like, I think we have an understanding. I'm not going to make him crazy. He's very supportive.
No,
Lou
I
is
said
my...
it's woo-woo.
Oh, you didn't say Lou? You said
No, I said
woo-woo?
woo-woo.
Woo-woo.
W-O-O-W-O-O.
Oh. No, Lou, I used to listen
I mean,
to...
the spirit is...
Yes,
the feeling of
about
something
spirits.
there.
We can talk about this, and he does agree with me, even though he may not feel the same way. So, for example, I have notions about spirits who might... a consciousness that comes back after death, and I've seen things. And I don't expect him to experience, ghosts in the same way, but there was a period in which he did, and he finds rational ways to explain it, and it becomes our joke, where...
I love the fact that I asked you about woo-woo when you talked about Lou, which is great because...
I'm sorry, I thought you were saying Lou.
No, we're both
Lou.
at that age now where hearing is not
Yeah, no,
exactly
sorry.
as
I
it
thought
should
you
be.
meant is Lou into woo-woo.
Well, that's even more revealing. You see, I'm glad I'm bringing it even...
See,
Let's- you
you
know, we're
know
ta-
too much about my life now.
Well, let's talk more about craft and about story and about plot and all of that. You're now an American master. You've got that title, not only an American master, but you've got an international readership and so forth. And as part of the American Master Series, here's Amy Tan once more.
When I first decided to be a writer, the two questions that mattered the most to me is what is voice and what is story, and which determines which. Did voice come first, or was it the story came first? And I realized after writing for a while that voice is basically your mind, your consciousness, everything that happened to you up until this point from your birth. It is the way that you think. And in terms of a story, it becomes the guide that you give the reader into the world you are going into. It is the things that you choose to observe, the things that you see as conflicted or contradictory. So many people say you need to find your voice as a writer. And basically what they're talking about is what is true to you as a writer, what makes you different and unique from every other writer. That is what's going to speak to somebody. It's going to speak to the editor, the publisher, the people who want a voice that is like no other voice out there.
So well said. And I keep thinking, boy, she started out writing astrology and horoscopes, and and here you are,
That's the woo-woo,
an American
yeah,
master.
yeah. Yeah.
That was just to pay the bills going way back. But let me come right to the point here. How does one? I mean, what do you tell young people about discovering that voice? Because so many young people are looking for their voice, like somehow eureka, I found it, and yet what they're really trying to find and need to find is something that's true to themselves and that's an original voice, don't they?
Well, I think you can foster that starting at a very young age. Say a 5-year-old who has imagination is also having relationships in school. And the encouragement would be on observation. And as you know, I'm a real lover of nature, especially birds. And one of the ways we can improve our observational skills with people is to also look for that in birds and to always question what we don't know. We're seeing this, we're curious, what don't we know? So with young children, you can talk about that, but also about the moral dilemmas they get into. For example, they're helping a child, a friend of theirs, but what they've done was counter to what their parents wanted them to do, and they were punished for that in some way, chastised. These are early moral questions that children have, and I do believe that the more a person, a child, a young adult, an adult, observes and questions and sees, all the strands of where you might find truth, that is an enormous skill that a writer can have.
And a way to find voice. You wrote a children's book, too. You've actually written a couple of children's books. Talk about the creation of a children's book a little bit, maybe? How it's different, or what goes into it?
That is the one place where I do have to think of the reader, because it's going to be a young reader. And if I'm writing about a cat, I'm certainly not going to have the cat get run over by a truck. And in fact, there was a cartoon series based on Sagwa, the Chinese Siamese cat, PBS, and there was a cricket that we were going to have be supposedly crushed by a cartwheel. And they said we couldn't even suggest that. It would be too upsetting to the children watching it. So I think that, I have to be conscious of my readers at that point. With the first one, The Moon Lady, it was actually a story that was in the Joy Luck Club, which is also called The Moon Lady. Only now I had taken it and put it into child's perspective and a woman looking back at who she was at the time. What does it mean to be lost? And when you're lost, what do you want? The other story was Sagwa, the Chinese Siamese cat. That came from a dream that I had. The Moon Lady also was from a dream. So I think these very loose stories, this idea for a story comes through dreams because they have the fantastical elements that children have when they have not been limited in their imagination or how they look at the world. They don't know the absolute right and wrong. They're testing everything out. And that is the great part of writing children's books and creating a series like Sagwa. To me, when I was a creative consultant, I came up with some storylines, just paragraph. But I would say what I want out of this cartoon series is ambiguity at a child's level of what they're looking at and questioning and saying, I'm feeling this, but what should I, somebody else is feeling that. I wanted that for these children because it was emotional nourishment. So that's how I think, I think about the audience of readers.
Put yourself in a child's mind with the sense of wonder and awe and inquisitiveness and all of that.
And distress and worry.
And the worry.
I think
anxiety.
we think I think we're often thinking of, wonderment and curiosity only with children's books. And even I know at a very young age, at age 6, I'm thinking about death. Not that all 6-year-olds think of that. I had a suicidal mother, so naturally I'm thinking about death. But there are many other concerns that children have that I think are very dark and very lonely. When somebody doesn't understand your emotions, you're very lonely, whether you're a kid or an adult. And those are in part, those were the stories I wanted to address in my children's books, but in an accessible, non-threatening way.
Well, when you write fiction, and maybe this is true about memoir children's books too, I don't know, but when you write fiction, you say you feel like you're listening to music, and I was interested in that. Just from the perspective, you kind of let it wash over you in many ways?
When fiction writing is at its best, when you have gone through and taken out the thorns and the tangles and the big mess and the garbage dump, and everything is moving ahead more smoothly, that's when it becomes like music. When I was talking about music, it had to do with, I wrote about this in the memoir, that there are oftentimes when I'm listening to very long concertos, for example, Rachmaninoff is one of my favorites, I see a story and it just unfolds effortlessly. I can tell you at the moment what is happening in the story based on the music. And that is the kind of flow, the freedom, the natural, dreamlike quality of storytelling that I want to get to. It doesn't always happen in the beginning. In fact, when it does happen, I think most writers will agree that you're so elated. It's such a huge high. It is the reason why you want to keep writing. You have entered into another realm of yourself, or yourself into a different place.
Is another realm, or is it more your unconscious?
Yes, it is definitely. I talk about it in different ways. It's very hard to explain to other people what this realm is. I've talked about it in terms of these eidolons, which often people associate with something negative, boogeymen or something. But to me, there's this idealized self that's always there waiting for me to find, what really is. All, not a single answer, but all the strands of that. So this other person who knows me the best, and it's imaginary, it's just a concept, it's not that I actually think there's a person behind me. But that is the feeling, in a sense. So that person exists in a different realm. You could say it's the muse. You could say it's a spirit ghost, like my grandmother being right there. And I want that sense that I can detach myself from the current world and the people that I know and go into the fictional one, which includes something I don't have in the real world.
Ryan Davis and Sarah Rose Leonard were working behind the scenes assiduously, and I think, Sarah, you have some, we were going to go to questions from the audience at 8 o'clock. I think it may be time to do that. If you want to bring those forward, I'll just be the receptacle here and go right to your questions, and thank you, those of you who have put questions to Amy. The Valley of Amazement is my go-to recommendation. What are your plans of writing another book?
That's what my editor asks all the time. That is the most anxiety-producing question that you can ask any writer. What are you working on? When writers and I when I'm with certain writers, occasionally we talk about this question and how we spend years feeling guilty and anxious. As things don't come out, you'll sit down for 10 minutes and nothing comes out, or you'll sit down for 8 hours and nothing comes out, and you feel like it's never going to catch fire and go anywhere. So this question of what are you writing about, the truthful answer is nothing. And it's very distressing to recognize that every time you hear the question. But thank you for liking that book. That was a very different book for me because it was investigating a question I had about my grandmother, a mystery that came up. And I wanted to understand how she had passed along certain emotions, emotional DNA, so to speak, not really in my genome, but passed down as an inheritance to my mother and to me, transformed in a way, but what are these characteristics?
Well, with epigenetics, we may not know, actually.
Yes.
But
there's
your
questions
grandmother,
about
we should
that.
mention, you found out a great deal about. She was in concubinage.
She was a concubine, but the question is still there whether she was forced to be a concubine or whether she willingly agreed. And that's an important question in my family and how they look at her, because as a widow, she never should have willingly gone to become a concubine. There was a question too, in a photo that I saw of her dressed in this really elaborate costume with a headdress, high collar, certain jewelry. And then I found a photo same year called The 10 Beauties of Shanghai, and they were courtesans. And the clothing was exactly the same, as though they had gone to the J.C. Penney's of 1910 and picked out of the rack the exact same dress. And so I had to ask myself, why is she wearing these clothes? Maybe she was a playful person, as I am. I put on dominatrix clothes. It doesn't mean I'm a dominatrix. But what was the reason? Because in our family, she was known as being very old-fashioned and quiet. And I found evidence to the contrary. By the way, you mentioned Henry Louis Gates, and he asked if I would be on that show, Finding Your Roots. And I'm really excited about that because I'm hoping they can find the answers to some of the questions.
It took
that
me
I
years
have.
to be comfortable calling him Skip, but now
Yeah,
we're,
Skip, right.
we're on
right.
that kind of.
Yeah, the first time I met him, I was at a conference called The State of the Language about English, and I had to talk. I was apologetic part of the time, and then I read something that I'd written the night before about mother tongue, and that has become my most reprinted piece ever.
I read that piece. Let me pause there for a moment, just for the benefit of the audience. Henry Louis Gates, for many years, still is, in fact, if he's not emeritus, I believe, head of African American Studies at Harvard, and also someone many of you know through PBS, because he has a special on tracing genealogy that he's been doing for a number of years now. But I was fascinated by that whole question of the mother tongue, and you're getting into the sense of, because many have identified you as a writer, like you alluded to before, writing about the immigrant experience and how the immigrant experience is tied to the mother tongue. And communication is so central to understanding how that communication comes across.
Well, I think the mother tongue is not just, something you see in immigrants. I think it is that we all have different languages, different English languages. There's the one that's interior, there's the one that you use with certain people, there's one that you use with kids, your children, your spouse, your friends. And that I was a student of linguistics, so I'm very, very interested in the dynamics that these shifts in language use that really speak to relationship. A dear friend of mine, Deborah Tannen, also writes about this, sociological linguistics, family relationships, and how language shifts according to that. So it's mother tongue. I happen to have a really interesting mother who had a language, a public language, had a language she used with me, and I imagined her interior language, which would not be broken and would be absolutely clear and beautiful.
Yeah, for some reason, the old joke comes to my mind about if you speak 3 languages, you're trilingual. If you speak 2, you're bilingual. If you speak 1, you're an American. But I'm just thinking of mother tongues and all.
I speak 4 badly, or 1 sort of okay. English, although did you know I got in the 400s on the SAT in English and 700s?
I know. I used to kid you about that.
700s in Spanish. Okay, why? How is that?
Well, here's a question. Someone wants to know, how has your connection to China changed your perspective of San Francisco?
Well, how has China's perspective changed towards us and what's going on there? That is a really complex question because the first time I went to China, or how I thought about China, came through a place of ignorance and in thinking I had nothing to do with that culture, and then finding I very much was part of that in certain ways. Yet also I could not claim the experiences that my sisters went through during the Cultural Revolution. And today, of course, China is not what it was 30 years ago. China is so modern and aggressive and consumer-oriented. And, there are a lot of things going on that would make me uncomfortable if I lived there. I think it will be a while before I would go back to China as a writer. And in fact, if I go to China, when I write down, you have to write down in your visa application what you do. I would never put down that I'm a writer.
You had concerns about going to Burma during the military junta there, Myanmar, if we want to call it what they call themselves now, and they were moral concerns. I think people would have moral concerns about going to China now, don't you?
I think that certain people would. If they go into a country with the notion of looking at how the government, how politics affect people, especially in certain groups, certain minorities, for example. And in China, there are many, many minorities, including those who have been, put in these camps. It's the same way that I approached going into Myanmar, which was I had the notion of wanting to see and not knowing what it is I should look for, that it would be a gradual process of finding the focus. And also with this question of how would you ever restore this country to the tenets of democracy that Aung San Suu Kyi had in mind. Especially, and the question has changed over the years now that Aung San Suu Kyi, the elected president back in 1989 or whatever it was,
Now talk about
where
emotions
she has
changing
flipped
through
over.
history and memory.
Yeah, everything
Wow.
keeps changing, and that's why I say these truths are never static. There's always things that flood into it, and cause you to reflect and to ask these questions. So, going into Myanmar, somebody had said to me, "How can you go to that country? It means you're in collusion with the government." No, it doesn't mean that at all. But I did, because of the situation there, I wanted to go in there with a particular sensitivity to understanding what was going on. Understanding not the politics so much as the people and how they were affected by that. How did they see it? What was the despair? What was the fear? What was the hope? How were things normal in a way? This is the status quo. So all of those questions became very interesting to me. And it's something I think about when I go into any country where I am the foreigner. I can't make American assumptions and see that that's how it operates there. And it's certainly much more of a question when I go into a country like China that I'm tied to in many different ways through its history.
This prompts me also to explore something with you that has to do with the role of the novelist. It used to be a public role for a novelist to opine on, now we have Twitter, of course, everybody opines on everything, but used to opine on anything political, and they would be asked questions. You used to be asked questions, I know, early on after the Joy Luck Club about what you thought was going on in Beijing and how you felt about Shanghai and, South China and Taiwan and all these kinds of things. And the role of the novelist used to be a much more capacious one in that sense. It's just changed, hasn't it?
Right. Well, I think that we had periods of literature, social realism, or George Orwell's take on why do you write, and that everything you write is political in some way, and that this is a question you have to think about what you're doing with this writing and its effect on others. I happen to be one of those writers who believes I cannot take a political point of view to begin with, because then I would drive my narrative in a certain direction that is not fresh. It is a conclusion before I even begin. But I know that there are people who would take a situation, a political situation, a social situation, and I also see those are the novels that win the prizes, because people do still want books to be important to address these questions, these thorny questions of humanity. And I admire that, but that is a difference. That is not the way that I approach my writing. I ultimately might get to the same questions, but I come from it from a different angle.
I have time maybe for one more question. Actually, the question is which of your novels should be made into a film. Joy Luck Club was made into a film, and so was, it wasn't made into a film, it was on the way to be made. Bonesetter's Daughter, was that?
Oh, that was, Bonesetter's Daughter was turned into an opera.
It was an opera, yeah.
An opera, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
But I have a question sort of adjacent to that, but this person says, if they made a movie about your life, who should play you?
Oh my God,
a
I have
whimsical but
never
good
thought of
question.
that
Thank you.
before. I have no idea. I hate to admit this, I don't watch that many movies or TV, so I don't know who the cool Asian Awkwafina. I would love Awkwafina to play me. Okay. Yeah.
See how well your memory works there.
Yeah, Awkwafina. It suddenly came to me, like, who's irreverent, who is always going to be a rebel in some way and outrageous at times, but also, quite considerate of family and friends.
Well, the question that I was going to ask,
Well, in her movies, at least, yeah.
which was kind of triggered by that, is if you had to take one of your books and put it in a time capsule. I mean, it's an old cliche question in some ways, but it's something that's fascinating to me because especially somebody who's written a number of books as you have, different kinds of books, they're all your children, is the old cliche too. But if you had to put one into the future, which would it be?
Let me first say that I'm somebody who's not really concerned with posterity with my books, my work. A lot of people think that's wrong, that you should think about legacy, posterity, who's going to be affected later. And I can't write with that notion in mind because that adds to self-consciousness and a little bit of too much ego and thinking about this is going to be important in the future. But I would choose, if somebody asked me, please choose something to put in here, I would choose Joy Luck Club, but mostly because of the way that it's been used. It was an early book. What it got people talking about, it was before there were many different books by people who were Asian. And so what its effect has been on literature itself, or the many things that people might have gotten from the book. So that's the reason. Not that it's my favorite or the most compelling or the most personal, but I have to think of the reasons why somebody would put something into a capsule. It's not about me as the number one part of it. If it was about me and I wanted to say who I was for posterity, it would be a memoir. But that would not be my reason.
Okay, one final question. Have you experienced discrimination given your minority identities, or has the reckoning in the past couple of years affected you, and in what way?
Oh, certainly. I've experienced it all my life. I remember early on at the age of 6 experiencing that. And it's heightened, of course, in the last 5 years. I usually get this hatred, this spew directed to me on social media. I found that if President Biden posts anything on Facebook and I do a like, or I say, thank you, President Biden, there's like 1,000 comments about you, and then you think of all the expletives and every single kind of disgusting animal that goes with that. And that's what I get. And plus, go back to China, or stop eating dogs, or, all those kinds of things. And early on, it used to really disturb me. And now I just think, no, this is part of the territory. I just can't take it seriously.
You're also writing a lot on Facebook, I notice. I mean, does it disturb you, for example, Hillary Clinton, I just heard today, referred to Facebook just the other day as a disinformation network. And, you have these recent whistleblower testimonies about Facebook and so forth. I mean, does that weigh on you at all?
Yeah, I think it's a problem with
Especially
Facebook.
when I think of Burma, too, Myanmar.
Yeah. A lot of my, I try to be very careful, and when I express political opinion when I think it's very important, when I think it's harmful to people, when the situation I think is harmful and needs to be addressed, or I can't stop myself from talking about it. Most of my posts, however, are about birds.
And you've done, may I
About-
say, just for the record, done some great photography of birds. I mean, just the many talents that you have.
I've never thought of myself as being a great photographer. I have
you
these
have.
pocket cameras that I use to take.
Daisy wanted you to be what, a pianist or a doctor?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, all
These
these
are
other
far
avatars.
removed, far
that was-
removed.
and
But
you
the
wanted to be an
photography is
artist.
for the sake of drawing the birds. So
Well, it's my good luck and joy to be talking to you again and be in conversation with you. Hope everybody found it pleasant and enjoyed it and was enlightened and illuminated, because that always happens when I have the great privilege of talking to Amy. And may I just say in conclusion, she has her usual vibrancy and everything on 1 hour sleep. So that gives testimony in itself. Thank you all so much for being here. And please, another hand for our guest, Amy King.
thank you. Thank you, Michael.